Hello! Welcome to English for Shared. Here, you learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's go!
Adolf Hitler, from dark childhood to World War II. Few figures in history have caused as much impact and destruction as Adolf Hitler. His name is directly linked to World War II and the Holocaust, two of the greatest horrors humanity has ever faced. But behind the dictator who changed the course of history lies the trajectory of a man born into an ordinary family who had a difficult youth and, throughout his life, transformed his frustrations and radical beliefs into a project of absolute power. Hitler's life is not just that of a politician or military leader. It is also that of someone who knew how to manipulate crowds, exploit crises, and exploit people's fears to achieve his goals. Therefore, studying his biography is essential to understanding how tragic events can arise from the choices of a single man and an entire society that supported him. In this account, we will travel from Adolf Hitler's childhood in a small Austrian town to his death at the end of the war in 1945. We will learn how his extreme ideas were formed, how he came to power, and how his leadership plunged the world into the greatest conflict of the modern era. This is not just the story of a dictator, but also a warning to future generations. It shows how far hatred, intolerance, and the thirst for power can take humanity.
Childhood and youth. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in the small town of Braunau am Inn, Austria, right on the border with Germany. His family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. His father, Alois Hitler, worked as a customs official and had an extremely strict personality. He was known for being stern and authoritarian, demanding absolute obedience from his children. His mother, Clara, was a loving and devoted woman who always sought to protect young Adolf from her husband's harsh demands. This contrasting relationship between his mother's affection and his father's harshness profoundly marked his childhood. From an early age, Hitler displayed a difficult temperament. He didn't take orders easily and frequently clashed with his father, who wanted him to follow the same bureaucratic career as a civil servant. However, Adolf had other dreams. From a young age, he showed an interest in art, particularly painting and architecture. He enjoyed drawing, and his mother, always patient, encouraged this talent, believing he could build a future in it. At school, Hitler was not a model student. Although he had a certain aptitude for subjects related to history and art, he was lazy in other subjects and rebellious toward his teacher's authority. This behavior resulted in poor grades and eventually his dropping out of school. He never completed high school, something that would later become one of his greatest frustrations. As a teenager, young Adolf made an important decision. He wanted to be an artist. He dreamed of entering the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, where he could develop his skills in painting and architectural drawing. In 1907, after his mother's death, he decided to pursue this path. He moved to Vienna with great hope, but when he took the entrance exams, he failed. He tried again the following year, and once again, he was rejected. These rejections deeply damaged his self-esteem. Unable to realize his artistic dream, Hitler lived a hard life in Vienna. He often had no money for rent or food, and even lived in shelters for the poor. During this period, he began to gravitate toward nationalist ideologies, and especially anti-Semitic rhetoric, which was common in parts of Viennese society at the time. Personal hardships and the city's political climate helped shape his increasingly radical and intolerant thinking. This youthful phase, marked by frustration, poverty, and isolation, was decisive in shaping the future dictator. Hitler went from a young man with artistic dreams to a resentful man harboring anger against those he believed responsible for his failures. This resentment grew and transformed into a dangerous ideology that would later impact not only his life, but the history of the entire world.
The soldier of the First World War. When World War I broke out in 1914, Adolf Hitler was 25 and living aimlessly, having failed as an artist in Vienna and Munich. The war seemed like an opportunity to find purpose and serve a greater cause. He voluntarily enlisted in the German army, finally feeling part of something that gave him identity and meaning. For him, military life was a kind of refuge where discipline and camaraderie replaced the loneliness and failure of his youth. During the conflict, Hitler served as a courier, responsible for carrying information between the front lines and command. This work was extremely risky, as it required crossing battlefields under enemy fire. Despite the constant danger, he performed his duties with courage and determination, earning the respect of his comrades. He even received medals, such as the Iron Cross, for bravery in combat. Even while experiencing the horrors of the trenches, Hitler seemed to find satisfaction in the life of a soldier. He dedicated himself completely to the army and avoided forming close ties with his comrades, preferring to live a reserved life. Still, the war environment reinforced in him a spirit of discipline and a belief in military strength as the path to restoring Germany's greatness. In 1916, Hitler was wounded for the first time, struck by shrapnel during a battle. After recovering, he returned to the front, demonstrating his willingness to continue serving. 2 years later, in 1918, he suffered a new trauma. He was hit by a mustard gas attack, which left him temporarily blind. He spent weeks in a military hospital, where he received the most devastating news of his life. Germany had lost the war. The defeat was a profound shock to Hitler. He believed Germany was winning, and the news of the surrender plunged him into despair. Like many other soldiers, he felt he had been stabbed in the back by politicians and civilians, especially Social Democrats and Jews, who became his preferred targets of hatred. This idea of internal betrayal took root in his mind and would become one of the foundations of his future political propaganda. The end of the war did not mean the end of Hitler's military spirit. On the contrary, he emerged from the conflict convinced that Germany's destiny was to rise again through force of arms and the leadership of someone capable of uniting the people around a greater purpose. World War I not only gave him military experience, but also cemented his resentment and radical worldview, paving the way for his entry into politics in the following years. The beginning of a political career. After the end of World War I, Germany plunged into crisis. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh punishments on the country, loss of territory, military limitations, and enormous reparation debts. The people were disillusioned, suffering from unemployment, hunger, and runaway inflation. It was in this context that Adolf Hitler, still lost about his future, found the opportunity to transform his ideas into political action. In 1919, he joined a small group called the German Workers' Party. At first, it was just one of many parties emerging during this period of instability. But Hitler soon stood out. He had a special talent for speech-making. His firm voice, intense gestures, and ability to convey emotion captivated audiences. His inflammatory speeches against Jews, communists, and foreigners attracted the attention of frustrated people seeking blame for the country's situation. Soon, Hitler was no longer just an ordinary member. He became the main spokesman of the group, which soon changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the famous Nazi Party. Under his leadership, the party gained strength and began to attract more and more followers, especially those who felt humiliated by the defeat in the war and the conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1923, Hitler believed the moment was ripe to seize power by force. Inspired by authoritarian movements in other countries, he organized the so-called Beer Hall Putsch, an attempted coup d'état in Munich. The plan, however, failed. The police reacted. An armed confrontation ensued, and Hitler was eventually arrested. Many might have thought this would mark the end of his political career, but surprisingly, the opposite was true. During his months in prison, Hitler wrote the book My Struggle, Mein Kampf, in which he expounded his racist, nationalist, and authoritarian ideas. The book was not an immediate success, but it served as a Nazi manifesto and made clear his ambitions to transform Germany into a power and eliminate all those who, in his view, weakened the nation. When he was released from prison in 1924, Hitler found a reorganized party and an even larger support base. The arrest, which could have destroyed his career, actually strengthened his image. He came to be seen by many as a nationalist martyr, a man willing to sacrifice his freedom for the future of Germany. From then on, Hitler temporarily abandoned plans to seize power through violence and decided on another strategy: conquering the government through the ballot box, manipulating democracy, and then destroying it from within.
The rise to power. The global economic crisis of 1929 was the big boost Adolf Hitler needed to expand his influence. Germany, already weakened by debts from the Treaty of Versailles, was hit hard. Millions of people lost their jobs, hunger increased, and despair gripped the population. In this scenario of misery and insecurity, Hitler's promises of national reconstruction, employment for all, and the restoration of German pride gained enormous traction. With his oratorical skills and massive use of propaganda, Hitler managed to transform the Nazi Party into one of the country's most powerful political forces. His fiery speeches spoke of hope, but also spread hatred against Jews, communists, and other groups whom he blamed for Germany's decline. With each election, the party gained more seats in parliament, until it became virtually impossible to ignore. In January 1933, faced with popular pressure and political instability, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, the second highest position in the government. To many, he seemed like just another politician, controllable by traditional elites. But he soon showed that his ambitions were much greater. A few months later, taking advantage of a fire in the German parliament, Hitler passed laws that suspended individual freedoms and allowed the imprisonment
of opponents without trial. Over time, Hitler eliminated rival parties, persecuted opponents, and increasingly concentrated power in his own hands. In 1934, after the death of President Paul von Hindenburg, he combined the offices of Chancellor and President, assuming the title of Führer, meaning supreme leader. By this time, German democracy had already disappeared, and Nazism had become an authoritarian regime based on a cult of personality, blind obedience, and violence against any opposition. To ensure his grip on power, Hitler relied on repressive institutions such as the Gestapo, secret police, and the SS, elite military forces that spread fear throughout Germany. He also used propaganda strategically: films, newspapers, posters, and even radio broadcast messages that exalted his image and reinforced nationalism. In the eyes of many Germans, he appeared to be the man who was restoring dignity and greatness to the country. However, behind this image of renewal and progress, the Nazi regime hid a dark plan. The persecution of Jews, communists, Roma, and other groups intensified, with laws that excluded them from society and stripped them of basic rights. Germany gradually became a totalitarian state, where obedience to the Führer was mandatory and any sign of opposition could cost one's life. The path to war and global tragedy was already being paved.
The Second World War. In 1939, Adolf Hitler implemented his plan for territorial expansion. He had already annexed Austria and taken part of Czechoslovakia without much international resistance. On September 1st, he took the decisive step. He ordered the invasion of Poland. This act provoked an immediate reaction from England and France, which declared war on Germany. Thus began World War II, a conflict that would engulf almost the entire planet and become the bloodiest in history. In the early years, Hitler seemed invincible. German military strategy, known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, combined rapid attacks with tanks, aircraft, and infantry, surprising enemies. Within a few months, Germany conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. The world watched in awe of the Nazi advance, and many believed that Hitler would truly create a lasting empire in Europe. As he expanded his domains, Hitler implemented increasingly cruel policies against Jews and other persecuted groups. Beginning in 1941, with the so-called Final Solution, the Nazi regime began organizing concentration and extermination camps on a large scale. Millions of men, women, and children were deported to places like Auschwitz, where they were subjected to forced labor, starvation, torture, and executions in gas chambers. This genocide would become known as the Holocaust, one of the greatest atrocities ever committed against humanity. In 1941, Hitler made a fatal mistake. He decided to invade the Soviet Union, breaking a non-aggression pact he had signed with Joseph Stalin. At first, the German armies advanced rapidly, but soon encountered fierce resistance and difficulties in the Russian winter. The war in the East turned into a nightmare for German soldiers, who suffered from cold, hunger, and Soviet counterattacks. The situation worsened further in 1941 when the United States entered the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. From then on, Germany faced powerful enemies on several fronts: the Soviets in the east and the British and Americans in the west. The defeats began to pile up. Battles like Stalingrad and Normandy marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. Even in the face of defeat, Hitler refused to admit reality. He continued to believe he could turn the tide with new weapons and miraculous strategies. However, the truth was that the Third Reich was collapsing. The power that had seemed unshakable in 1939 was now rapidly crumbling, leaving a trail of destruction, millions of deaths, and entire cities in ruins.
The fall and death. By early 1945, Germany was already collapsing. The Allied advance was overwhelming. On one side, the Soviets were pushing German troops back from the east, recapturing territory and marching toward Berlin. On the other, the British, Americans, and French were advancing from the west, following the success of the Normandy landings. What Hitler had dreamed of as a 1,000-year empire was crumbling in just 12 years. Faced with the chaos, Hitler took refuge in an underground bunker in Berlin, located beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was a dark, stuffy, and isolated space where the dictator spent his final days surrounded by loyal advisors and military personnel. Even with the city under constant bombardment, he insisted on issuing unrealistic military orders, believing in impossible counterattacks and increasingly demonstrating his detachment from reality. During this period, his physical and mental health was in shambles. Reports indicate that he suffered from constant tremors, was weakened, and had fits of rage against generals who contradicted him. At the same time, he demonstrated paranoia, believing in betrayals within his own circle of trust. Meanwhile, Berlin was destroyed. There was a lack of food, the population lived in makeshift shelters, and the German army no longer had the strength to resist. On April 29, 1945, in the bunker itself, Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. The wedding was simple and held in a farewell atmosphere as everyone knew the end was near. That same night, he dictated his political testament, in which he still blamed the Jews and the German generals for the defeat, demonstrating that until his last day he maintained intact the hatred and distorted convictions that guided him throughout his life. On the afternoon of April 30, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun decided to take their own lives. According to reports, Eva took poison, while Hitler committed suicide with a gunshot to the head. His aides, following instructions he had left, took the bodies out of the bunker, placed them in a bomb crater, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire to prevent their capture by the Soviets. The dictator who had caused the deaths of millions ended his life in ruins, hidden and defeated.
A few days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. World War II in Europe was officially over. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, was nothing more than a dozen years of terror, destruction, and tragedy. His death did not erase the scars it left, but it symbolized the end of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
Conclusion. Adolf Hitler's life is a grim portrait of how one individual can forever mark world history. From a conflicted childhood and frustrated artistic dreams, he transformed into a dictator capable of manipulating crowds and plunging entire nations into war.
His path was built on resentment, hatred, and a desire for absolute power, fueled by the social and economic crises facing the German people. His legacy is not one of greatness, but of destruction. Under his leadership, millions of people were killed on battlefields, bombings, and, most importantly, in the death camps of the Holocaust. Entire families disappeared, cities were razed, and humanity was forced to confront its worst ghosts. The mark Hitler left is, above all, a warning about the dangers of fanaticism, prejudice, and intolerance. At the same time, his story shows us the fragility of societies in the face of charismatic leaders who know how to exploit fears and hopes. Hitler didn't come to power alone. He was followed, supported, and cheered by millions who believed in his promises. This is a harsh but necessary reminder that responsibility for history never lies solely with those who govern, but also with those who choose to follow, support, or remain silent in the face of injustice. Ultimately, Hitler's trajectory serves as an eternal warning. The world he destroyed had to rebuild itself with great difficulty, learning lessons that cannot be forgotten. Remembering his biography is more than just looking back. It's understanding that freedom, peace, and respect for human life must be defended every day so that the tragedies he caused are never repeated.